Was a loser, now will be later to win.
Again, at least in the world of the middle class, women are coming into power. I mean, there's just no question about it. And that, again, my friend Doug Marsh, this always was his claim when he would teach social problems, is that the future belongs to women. Yeah, that was like that was a lecture, kind of, the future belongs to women. And I think to a large degree, it's true that when you look at the things I look at, wealth distribution, I look at speculative capitalism, you know, the people, women have, by some measures, women have more financial assets than men do. Think of the adaptation of a culture to sex differences as something that can vary. So you can have a culture that's entirely neutral, where the culture of the group simply passes along biological differences unchanged. You can have a culture like ours that augments the differences between men and women. So we have social arrangements that increase differences between men and women. All right? So whatever the natural or innate differences between men and women are, if you live in a society like ours, the culture winds up augmenting them. Or you can have an androgynous culture that has social arrangements that decrease the differences between men and women. That social democracy has a tendency towards androgyny. Social democracy has a tendency towards androgyny. So anytime you have social democratic processes and social democratic policies dominant, you have a tendency towards androgyny. For one reason, because women's equality is so emphasized in social democracy, and that in our time, the time period beginning in, say, the 70s forward, we've seen an increase in cultural differences between men and women, even though economic and political differences have declined. We've seen an increase in sort of cultural. There's a whole bunch of people right now who write about what's called symbolic masculinity, or cultural masculinity, for example, that men in our time actually will work hard to give off the appearance of masculinity. You can find maybe no better gauge for the modernity of a culture than the way that women's lives are shaped. Big issues of childbearing. Traditional cultures everywhere, I think I've told you this already, right? Had high death rates. And so if you have high death rates, if you're going to survive as a culture, you have to have high birth rates. So most traditional societies depend upon women having high fertility, being pregnant often, early and often, and having many children per woman. This is the keynote of the 1970s feminist movement, was to pass a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women's equality. And the United States passed the Congress, passed the Senate, the President signed it, and it had to get, what was it, 60% or whatever, the 75%, whatever the percentage of states is.
2/3, I think.
2/3 what it is, yeah, 2/3. It didn't make it. Illinois was the last state to defeat it, right? It all fell on Illinois in about 1983, and it went down, right? So, and it went down, many states ratified it immediately, and then it went down to this battle. All the southern states voted against it, basically. Most of the northern states didn't, and then it got to these middle states, right? The same states where you have the battleground every year of the presidency, that kind of thing, where it was argued out. So, and it was defeated by many women's groups, by the way, conservative women's groups who didn't want to see this bill passed. So again, it's interesting. It's like one of the most challenging things, if you can begin to revision what a world would look like that really has equality for men and women all the way through. Difficult thing to do. Okay, so I'm going to talk very briefly about the relationship between the family and gender. And I'm going to point towards the relationship between the family as an institution and class, and the family as an institution and race. All right? So we're going to look at two critical institutions, the family and education, as these important props for stratification. So our claim is going to be that the way that the family is structured helps reproduce racial inequality, class inequality, and gender inequality. Okay? And then we'll talk about education in the same way. These things actually are built by the system. They don't just happen on the side of it by accident. All right. Feminists today don't even talk about Betty Friedan anymore, which is sort of an interesting thing. But Betty Friedan, wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique in the 1960s, I believe. Very well-known book in the 1970s. She did this amazing analysis of ideological change after World War II in America. And her claim is that women in 1930s film, 1920s, 1930s film, 1920s, 1930s novels, 1920s, 1930s advertising even, were strong. Especially right after the feminist movement that led to the passage of the Suffrage Act and that led to women's political equality, that kind of thing. That women characters were strong. Women were encouraged to embrace the new world that used to be dominated by men. And there was kind of a pro-woman, progressive tilt to culture. That culminated in World War II when we had things like Rosie the Riveter and other efforts to actually encourage women to take over jobs that had been performed by men, as men were being inducted into the military in large numbers. So her claim is that like the early 20th century in America had been an era of increasing cultural equality and even cultural feminism. But then something happens. After World War II, as the soldiers who had been in World War II returned home, there was a counter-movement that encouraged women to return to traditional gender roles in the home, to give up the masculine occupations that they had occupied during World War II and become feminine again. And so she has this very interesting analysis of the return of traditional gender norms for women in America after World War II. Her claim was that basically America forestalled the feminist movement by maybe 30 years by having this backwards conservative era after World War II, okay? And so, so her claim is basically America, much more so than other modern countries, had a very weird 20th century. That at the very moment when most social democracies kept women in power and were increasing women's power and increasing women's equal access to public sector jobs and positions, America reversed, and we had a very, again, traditional 1940s, 1950s, where women, again, were embracing femininity, embracing home, embracing child rearing, embracing traditional feminine things. So we had this, again, this very weird thing that may be still shaping some of what is happening in gender relations today. That other countries didn't have the kind of strident, very aggressive conflict between feminist women and sort of, I guess what would be the right word, reactionary men. Feminism became more infiltrated in culture and normalized, but again, in part because of this backward movement during the 50s and 60s, we led to a very sort of conflict-oriented feminist movement in our time.
You've been a messin' where you shouldn't have been a messin', and now someone else is getting all your best. These boots are made for walking, and that's just what they'll do. One of these days these boots are gonna walk all over you.